For more than 3 decades, one man managed to hide a life so strange that, even after investigators uncovered it piece by piece, many people still struggled to believe it was real. He was the heir to one of New York City's wealthiest real estate families. He lived in luxury, moved comfortably among powerful people, and appeared to have every opportunity for a successful future. But behind that respectable image was a trail of disappearances, suspicious deaths, false identities, and unanswered questions that stretched across decades. Long before his arrest made international headlines, there were whispers that something about Robert Durst didn't add up. The question wasn't whether he had secrets. It was how those secrets remained hidden for so long. The Robert Durst case became one of the most extraordinary criminal investigations in modern American history, not because it centered on a single crime, but because it involved a series of events that unfolded over nearly 40 years. Different police departments, different states, and different victims all became connected by one man whose public image often seemed completely detached from the allegations surrounding him. Even today, investigators, journalists, and legal experts continue to study the case because it demonstrates how wealth, circumstance, and time can complicate even the most determined criminal investigation. To understand how the mystery began, it's necessary to go back to Robert Durst's early life. Robert Allen Durst was born on April 12, 1943, into one of New York City's most successful real estate families. His father, Seymour Durst, built a business empire that became one of the best-known property companies in Manhattan. From the outside, the Durst family appeared to represent wealth, influence, and stability. But according to family accounts reported over the years, Robert's childhood was marked by tragedy. When he was just 7 years old, his mother, Bernice Durst, died after falling from the roof of the family home. The circumstances of her death have been publicly reported as a suicide. Robert later gave differing accounts over the years about what he remembered from that day, and some relatives disputed portions of those memories. Because of those conflicting recollections, investigators have never treated his childhood memories as established facts. As Robert grew older, he attended private schools before studying economics at Lehigh University. He later enrolled in graduate studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, although he did not complete his degree. Friends from different periods described him in very different ways. Some remembered him as quiet and intelligent. Others recalled that he could appear distant, unpredictable, or socially awkward. None of those personal impressions, however, established that he had committed any crime. They simply illustrated that Robert Durst often left people with conflicting opinions. In 1973, Robert married Kathleen McCormick, a dental hygienist who was studying medicine. Friends described Kathleen as ambitious, independent, and determined to build a successful career. For several years, their marriage appeared ordinary from the outside. But according to later witness statements and testimony presented years afterward, the relationship experienced increasing tension. Friends later reported seeing signs that Kathleen appeared unhappy. Some also claimed she had spoken about marital problems. Those accounts became important only after Kathleen suddenly disappeared. On January 31, 1982, Kathleen Durst was last confirmed to have been seen alive. According to Robert Durst, he drove his wife to a commuter train station in Katina, New York, after they had spent time together at their home in South Salem. Robert told investigators that Kathleen boarded the train and that he never saw her again. But almost immediately, questions began to emerge. Family members became concerned when Kathleen stopped contacting friends and relatives. She failed to appear at medical school, something those close to her described as completely out of character. Police opened a missing person investigation. As detectives worked to reconstruct Kathleen's final known movements, they discovered inconsistencies that made the case increasingly difficult to explain. According to investigators, some witnesses challenged portions of Robert Durst's account of the timeline, while other evidence proved difficult to verify because critical hours had already passed before the investigation gained momentum. Years later, law enforcement officials would publicly acknowledge that the early investigation suffered from significant limitations. Missing person investigations in the early 1980s often lacked many of the forensic tools available today, and opportunities to preserve potential evidence were sometimes lost. Meanwhile, Robert Durst continued living his life. Although Kathleen had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, no criminal charges were filed against him at the time. Without sufficient evidence establishing that a crime had occurred, investigators could not move forward with a prosecution. For Kathleen's family, however, the unanswered questions never disappeared. As months turned into years, hope slowly gave way to uncertainty. What had happened after Kathleen was last seen? Had she left voluntarily, as some initially suggested? Or had investigators overlooked something that would later prove to be the key to the entire mystery? Those questions would remain unanswered for years. But what no one realized at the time was that Kathleen's disappearance would become only the beginning of a story that would eventually include another unexplained death, a dismembered body discovered in Texas, a nationally televised documentary, and one of the most astonishing recorded statements ever captured on a live microphone. By the late 1980s, Kathleen Durst had been missing for years, yet the investigation had made little progress. Detectives continued to receive occasional tips, but none provided the evidence needed to explain what had happened after she disappeared on January 31, 1982. For Kathleen's family, the lack of answers was devastating. They maintained that disappearing voluntarily was completely inconsistent with her plans. Kathleen had been attending medical school, remained close to her family, and, according to those who knew her, had been looking forward to becoming a physician. Investigators, however, faced a difficult challenge. Without a body, without forensic evidence establishing that a homicide had occurred, and without eyewitnesses who could directly contradict Robert Durst's account, prosecutors lacked the evidence required to bring criminal charges. For nearly 2 decades, the case remained unresolved. Then, another tragedy would unexpectedly place Robert Durst back under the attention of law enforcement. In December 2000, Susan Berman was found dead inside her home in Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles. Berman was a journalist and writer who had known Robert Durst for many years. Friends described them as being exceptionally close. According to investigators, Susan had also been interviewed in connection with Kathleen Durst's disappearance. Authorities determined that Susan Berman had died from a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. The killing appeared to have been targeted, and there were no immediate signs of a robbery. Almost immediately, investigators began asking an important question. Was Susan Berman's death connected to Kathleen Durst's disappearance? According to investigators, they believed Berman possessed information that could have become significant as the missing person investigation gained renewed attention. However, proving any connection between the two cases would require evidence that investigators did not yet have. Robert Durst denied any involvement. At the time, no charges were filed against him in Susan Berman's death. But what happened next would take the investigation in an entirely unexpected direction. Shortly after Susan Berman's murder, Robert Durst quietly left New York. Instead of living under his own name, authorities later discovered that he had rented an apartment in Galveston, Texas, using the false identity of a mute woman named Dorothy Sinear. Investigators later confirmed through court records that Durst had disguised himself while living in the apartment. Neighbors reported seeing someone they believed to be an elderly woman, unaware that the tenant was actually one of New York's wealthiest real estate heirs. The discovery stunned investigators. Why would a multimillionaire choose to hide his identity in such an unusual way? Durst later acknowledged using the false identity, but the reason for doing so became another subject of intense public interest. Then, in September 2001, events took an even darker turn. Authorities in Galveston responded after human remains were discovered floating in Galveston Bay. The victim was identified as Morris Black, a 71-year-old neighbor who had lived in the same apartment building as Durst. Investigators quickly learned that Black had disappeared days earlier. As detectives searched the apartment, they uncovered evidence linking Durst to the scene. He was arrested after authorities alleged that he had used Morris Black's identification and financial information following Black's death. But the most shocking detail had not yet emerged. According to court records, Robert Durst admitted that he had dismembered Morris Black's body after Black died. Durst claimed that the shooting occurred during a struggle inside the apartment and that he acted in self-defense. He acknowledged cutting up the body and disposing of the remains in Galveston Bay. That admission immediately attracted nationwide attention. Even experienced investigators found the circumstances extraordinary. Normally, a confession to dismembering a body would seem devastating in court. Yet, under American law, the central legal question was not whether Robert Durst had dismembered Morris Black's remains. The key question was whether prosecutors could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the shooting itself had been an intentional murder rather than lawful self-defense. The trial that followed became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in the country. Defense attorneys argued that Morris Black had confronted Durst with a firearm, that a struggle occurred, and that the weapon discharged accidentally during that confrontation. Prosecutors challenged that version of events, arguing that the evidence supported an intentional killing and that Durst's actions afterward demonstrated consciousness of guilt. The jury carefully examined the evidence presented in court. Then came a verdict that surprised much of the public. In 2003, Robert Durst was acquitted of murder in the death of Morris Black after the jury accepted that prosecutors had not disproved his claim of self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. He was, however, convicted on separate charges related to bail jumping and evidence tampering after fleeing before trial, resulting in additional prison time. For many observers, the verdict raised more questions than it answered. How had one man become connected to a missing wife, a murdered longtime friend, and a dismembered neighbor, yet still avoided a murder conviction? Even more importantly, investigators in New York and California had not stopped looking. Behind the scenes, detectives continued reviewing old evidence, interviewing witnesses again, and searching for the one piece of proof that might finally connect decades of unanswered questions. They would eventually find that opportunity in a place no one expected. A documentary film that Robert Durst voluntarily agreed to participate in. For years, investigators kept returning to the same unanswered questions. Kathleen Durst had disappeared without a trace. Susan Berman had been killed execution-style in her home. Robert Durst had admitted to dismembering Morris Black's body, but had been acquitted of murder in that case after a jury concluded prosecutors had not disproved his self-defense claim beyond a reasonable doubt. Each case seemed incomplete on its own. Together, they painted a picture that investigators simply could not ignore. Despite decades of scrutiny, law enforcement still lacked the evidence necessary to connect the cases in court. Detectives continued reviewing old files, interviewing witnesses, and searching for new forensic opportunities as technology improved. Then, something completely unexpected happened. Robert Durst agreed to participate in a documentary series. In the early 2010s, filmmaker Andrew Uretsky, who had previously directed the feature film All Good Things, a fictional drama inspired in part by the Durst case, began interviewing Robert Durst for what would become the HBO documentary The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst. Many people were surprised that Durst agreed to extensive on-camera interviews. For years, he had avoided detailed public discussions about the allegations surrounding him. Now, he appeared willing to answer difficult questions himself. Throughout the interviews, Durst often appeared calm and cooperative. He spoke about Kathleen's disappearance, Susan Berman's death, and the Morris Black case. At times, he challenged investigators' conclusions. At other moments, he offered explanations that raised even more questions. The documentary team also uncovered evidence that investigators had long considered important. One of the most significant discoveries involved an anonymous letter that had been mailed to police after Susan Berman's murder. According to investigators, the letter directed authorities to Berman's Beverly Hills residence and helped lead police to her body. Years later, documentary producers obtained another letter that Robert Durst had written to Susan Berman before her death. When the two envelopes were compared, investigators noticed striking similarities. According to court testimony, similarities included handwriting characteristics and the misspelling of Beverly instead of the correct spelling, Beverly. The documentary team shared this information with law enforcement. Investigators viewed it as potentially important new evidence. Durst denied writing the anonymous letter that alerted police to Susan Berman's body. Even so, authorities continued examining the handwriting evidence alongside other material they had collected over the years. Then came the moment that would capture worldwide attention. Near the end of filming, Robert Durst entered a restroom while still wearing a wireless microphone. Apparently believing the recording equipment had been turned off, he began speaking to himself. The microphone continued recording. The audio that followed became one of the most discussed moments in modern true crime history. Among the statements heard were words interpreted by many listeners as acknowledging responsibility for the deaths. Because portions of the recording are fragmented and have been interpreted differently by prosecutors and defense attorneys, the exact meaning became a subject of legal debate. Prosecutors argued that the recording demonstrated consciousness of guilt. Defense attorneys responded that the statements were taken out of context and should not be interpreted as a confession. The recording itself became powerful evidence in the court of public opinion, but its legal significance would ultimately be determined inside a courtroom rather than on television. Just one day before the final episode of the Jinx aired in March 2015, authorities arrested Robert Durst at a hotel in New Orleans. According to law enforcement, the timing of the arrest was based on the progress of the criminal investigation rather than the documentary's television schedule, although the release of new evidence had undoubtedly intensified public attention. Durst was charged with the murder of Susan Berman. The arrest marked one of the most dramatic developments in the decades-long investigation. For Kathleen Durst's family, it represented renewed hope that long-awaited answers might finally emerge. For investigators, however, the case was far from over. The years that followed involved complex legal proceedings, motions over the admissibility of evidence, delays related to Durst's health, and extensive courtroom arguments. Then, nearly 40 years after Kathleen Durst disappeared and more than 20 years after Susan Berman's murder, a jury finally began hearing the evidence. The trial would become the first opportunity for prosecutors to present decades of investigative work before a courtroom. And when the verdict finally arrived, it would forever change the public's understanding of one of America's most extraordinary true crime cases. When Robert Durst's murder trial finally began in California, it represented the culmination of decades of investigation. Jurors would hear evidence collected over many years, testimony from numerous witnesses, forensic analysis, and arguments linking one of the country's most unusual criminal cases together. At the center of the trial was the death of Susan Berman. Prosecutors argued that Berman had been killed because she possessed information that could have implicated Durst in the disappearance of his first wife, Kathleen. According to prosecutors, Berman had remained loyal to Durst for years, but as investigators renewed their interest in Kathleen's disappearance, they believed she had become a potential witness whose knowledge posed a serious risk. The prosecution presented a detailed timeline supported by witness testimony, documentary evidence, and forensic analysis. One of the most closely examined pieces of evidence was the anonymous letter sent to police after Berman's death. Prosecutors argued that handwriting comparisons, combined with other evidence, linked the letter to Robert Durst. The jury also heard portions of the now famous audio recorded during the filming of the Jinx. Prosecutors argued that the recording, when considered alongside all the other evidence, demonstrated guilt. The defense strongly disagreed. Durst's attorneys argued that the documentary had edited portions of the audio, creating an impression that was misleading. They maintained that Robert Durst never intentionally confessed to murder and insisted the prosecution's case relied too heavily on interpretation rather than direct proof. Throughout the lengthy trial, jurors examined thousands of pages of evidence accumulated over decades. Unlike television documentaries, which often condense events into a few hours, the courtroom process required every claim to be supported by testimony, documents, or admissible evidence. After months of proceedings, the jury reached its decision. In September 2021, Robert Durst was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Susan Berman. Jurors concluded that prosecutors had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Durst intentionally killed Berman to prevent her from providing information related to Kathleen Durst's disappearance. Shortly afterward, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many investigators, the verdict represented the first criminal conviction connecting Robert Durst to one of the long-suspected deaths. Yet even after the conviction, many important questions remained unanswered. Kathleen Durst had never been found. Despite decades of investigation, extensive searches, and countless interviews, her body has never been recovered. In 2017, a New York court officially declared Kathleen legally dead, but her disappearance remains one of the central mysteries of the entire case. Investigators have long stated that they believe Robert Durst was responsible for Kathleen's death, but because her body has never been located and no criminal trial regarding her disappearance was completed, many details remain unknown. Robert Durst was later indicted in New York in connection with Kathleen's death. However, those proceedings never reached trial. On January 10, 2022, just months after his conviction in California, Robert Durst died at the age of 78 while in the custody of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. According to official reports, he died from natural causes associated with multiple medical conditions. His death brought an end to any future criminal proceedings against him. For Kathleen's family, that meant one painful reality. Many of the answers they had hoped to hear inside a courtroom would likely never come. The Robert Durst case continues to be studied not only because of its extraordinary facts, but because it demonstrates how complicated long-term investigations can become. It shows how missing person cases can remain unresolved for decades. It highlights the importance of preserving evidence, re-examining cold cases as forensic science improves, and continuing investigations even when immediate answers seem impossible. The case also illustrates the difference between public suspicion and legal proof. For years, Robert Durst was the subject of intense speculation, but investigators still had to build cases that met the demanding standard required in criminal court. The eventual conviction for Susan Berman's murder was based on evidence presented before a jury, not on rumors, documentaries, or public opinion. Today, the disappearance of Kathleen Durst remains officially unsolved. Investigators have never stopped asking what happened after she was last seen on January 31, 1982. Her family has never stopped seeking the truth. And while one chapter of the Robert Durst story ended with a conviction and his death in prison, another chapter remains unfinished. Some mysteries survive because no one knows where to look. Others survive because the most important witness can no longer speak. The Robert Durst case is remembered as one of America's most remarkable true crime investigations. A story of immense wealth, hidden identities, decades of unanswered questions, and a search for justice that continued for nearly 40 years. Even today, one question continues to echo through every discussion of the case.